This week we come back to the story of Esther, picking up in chapter 4. So if you'd like to turn there with me, we'll read that in just a moment. The whole chapter, Esther 4. Once again, this is God's word. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. And he cried with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes in to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come in to the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So far, the reading of God's word. May he bless it to us this morning. Well, last time we were in Susa, a couple weeks ago, this edict of destruction had been sent out by the king to all of the officers in all of the provinces across the whole empire, sealed with the king's ring, this decree to kill, to destroy, to annihilate all of the Jews throughout the whole empire in one day, coming up in about 11 months, the 13th of Adar. And after the messengers went out, Ahasuerus and Haman, who had come up with this plot, they sit down to drink while the city of Susa is thrown into chaos. They're in shock. And the Jewish queen, Esther, is unaware of all of these things. The decree that has been issued to destroy her people, including her. That's where we left off. As you can see in the structure of the book, this is scene E. So we're getting close to the center of the story, to that turning point in chapter 6. So there's much ahead, but this chapter is very important. If it weren't for the decisions that Esther and Mordecai make in this chapter, the story would be over now. And so everything depends on what they do here. So again, the messengers have left. The edict is on its way. It's already been delivered in Susa, but it's on its way throughout the empire. And Mordecai has just learned about it. That's where we pick up in this scene. So he finds out all that's been going on. He knows even the amount of money that Haman has given the king or promised to the king in order to do this, the 10,000 talents of silver. And he knows what that means. A man who's willing to pay that price, almost the full amount of tribute the whole empire got in a year. If he's willing to do that, he's not just holding a grudge against Mordecai for not bowing down to him. He is set on this destruction of all the people. He's dedicated. And so Mordecai tears his clothes. He puts on sackcloth and ashes. He begins to mourn publicly in the middle of the city, not hiding anything. He is crying out loudly and bitterly, almost like howling with anger and grief and helplessness and whatever other emotions come with finding out that your people have just been sentenced to destruction by the most powerful man in the world. And so he's mourning, and he's going through the city. But then he stops outside the king's gate. He can't go any further. No one who's mourning like he is belongs inside the center of administration of this empire. We know Persia at this point. It's all about order and following the proper procedures and glory. And so there's no room for this man in rough cloth who's howling with grief. And so he stops at the entrance to the king's gate, as close as he can come. But he doesn't stop crying out. He continues his mourning. We get glimpses then of every other province where this proclamation has arrived, and the Jews react very similarly to Mordecai. There's fasting, there's weeping, there's wailing, there's laying on the ground in sackcloth and ashes as they find out their fate as well. And so from the capital in Susa to the edges of the empire, all the Jews who have learned about their set destruction are mourning and fasting. They're reaching out. They're turning for help. Inside the palace, again, Esther is unaware of these things. She's insulated from most of what happens outside of the palace by her royal chambers and all of these things that the king has built up to keep the ordinary concerns of the empire out of his home. And yet word does reach Esther, not about the edict, but through her servants. She learns that Mordecai is outside the gate in sackcloth and ashes. He's publicly mourning. And so when she hears this, she begins convulsing, is maybe the best word to describe her reaction. This involuntary reaction of her body, kind of like what your body does when you get a chill or when you feel nauseous, this involuntary reaction to this news that her adoptive father, for whatever reason it may be, is outside the king's gate just howling in grief and public mourning. Her body responds in this way of deep distress. But she still doesn't know about the edict, but she knows that the man who raised her is in distress, and that's enough for her to be in distress as well. So she wants to find out what is going on. And in order to do that, she sends Mordecai clothes. He can't come in the city like he's dressed now, so she sends out ordinary clothes. If he puts those on, then he can come and discuss with her. But Mordecai refuses the clothes without explanation. And so Esther has another plan. She summons Hathach, who is one of the king's eunuchs who's been specially assigned to her as her servant. And she sends Hathach to Mordecai, again, wanting to know what's happening and why it's happening. So Hathach makes his way from the palace to the city square. He's going from this place of marble and beauty and glory and the safety of the inner court into this city, the public area where there's a man in sackcloth with the full weight of this proclamation of death weighing on him. And so Hathach finds Mordecai, and Mordecai tells him everything. He tells him about the edict, he tells him about the amount of Haman's payment, and he even gives a copy of the edict, the actual document, to Hathach so that he can go back and show Esther. And so then he gives Hathach, along with that document, 3 commands. Show this to Esther, give her a report of what's happening, and then command her to go to the king. And then after she does those things, after she goes to the king, When she sees him, she needs to seek his kindness and his help for her people. Hathach faithfully does what Mordecai says. Esther hears it all. And then she replies to Mordecai, again through Hathach. All the king's servants and people know that anyone who goes before the king without being called by him is facing death. This is not something we're allowed to do, unless the king extends his golden scepter. But I haven't been called to see the king in 30 days. And so what Esther's saying is she knows that to approach the king unsummoned equals death, unless he gives a specific pardon. And she's not thinking it's likely that the king will be happy to see her if he hasn't called on her in 30 days, his own queen. After Mordecai heard this from Esther, he replied, "Don't think for a minute that you will be spared from this genocide because of your position in the palace. You're in the same boat as the rest of us, as all the Jews." Mordecai seems to think that Esther is assuming that just because she's the queen, even though she's a Jew, she's going to be spared. But Mordecai doesn't think it's going to play out like that. He knows the kind of man that Haman is. He knows how determined Haman is on destroying all of the Jews, young and old, women and children. And so he thinks that his adopted daughter is banking on being sheltered when actually she's going to be destroyed along with the rest. So Esther's right that it's risky to go before the king unsummoned. There's risk involved. But Mordecai is saying, it's certain destruction if you don't do anything. You need to act. Mordecai goes on, "In fact, if you don't speak up right now, relief and rescue will appear for the Jews from another place. But you and your family will die." And so he doesn't explain his reasons, but Mordecai is confident that not all the Jews are going to be wiped out on the 13th of Adar. That's what the edict says, but Mordecai is confident that's not how it's going to play out. Relief is going to come from someplace. But that doesn't mean that every Jew will escape the Persian death sentence, including Esther and himself. If Esther doesn't act, they're both going to die. He thinks the destruction is going to begin in the capital itself. And so Mordecai says, who knows? He asks this question, who knows? Maybe it's the case that this whole chain of improbable events, the queen contest, Esther winning and concealing her identity, Mordecai's service as an official at the king's gate, the crisis arriving now in this particular way with this particular woman on the throne, maybe all of this is not an accident. Maybe there's a reason behind it. Maybe it was for a moment like this that you came to be a part of the royal family. And then nothing on Esther's end in terms of her thoughts, her fears, her concerns. We're not told about any of that. Instead, we only see her take charge. She begins to direct and to act. "Go, gather all the Jews in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink anything for 3 days, night and day. I and my female servants will do the same. And then, even though it's against the law, I will go before the king." And so now another fast is called. This is not the same fast as the one at the beginning of the chapter. That was a sort of impromptu reaction to figuring out or finding out that your entire people have been sentenced to death. That was a spontaneous response to terrible news. But now Esther's calling this new fast that has a specific goal in mind. There is an act of courage that she has before her, and she needs help. And so she calls on all of her people to join her in fasting for 3 days, stop eating and drinking, so that she might be brave. The edict of destruction went out, so it was delivered on the 13th of Nisan, which is the day before Passover. Passover's on the 14th. And so this means that Esther has set this fast to overlap with a feast that Israel ordinarily would observe, the feast celebrating how God delivered them out of Egypt, a feast that they were commanded to keep Otherwise, they sin. But Esther's fast is going to run through that. And so this year, the Jews of Susa will not feast. They won't keep Passover. Instead, this feast of their deliverance is suspended so that they can fast for their deliverance. Esther's final line then in this chapter is an expression of her courageous faithfulness. If I perish, she says. If I am going to die, then I'll die. I'm willing to accept that outcome. She's not despairing. She's determined to do this. She's set her mind on these things. But she's determined in the dark, so to speak. She doesn't know how things are going to turn out. She has no map telling her exactly what to do, where to go. She has no sign, no dream, no confirming word from the Lord that the plan she's making is the right plan. And she's not seeking these things. She's fasting, and her community fasts with her, but she's willing to act on what Mordecai suspects, that maybe she's not the queen of Persia by accident, even without any confirmation that her action will succeed. And then chapter 4 closes with a reversal. At the beginning, Mordecai was commanding Esther to do things, exercising his parental authority. But now at the end of the chapter, Esther is commanding Mordecai to do things, and he obeys as she exercises her royal authority. He crosses from the gate precinct to the lower city where the Jews lived, and Esther, meanwhile, prepares to go to the king. And that's where the scene ends. Now, there's a question that this part of the story presses on us. What is it that makes Esther willing to act without knowing the outcome? In the story, she doesn't go to the king immediately. She calls for this fast, not just because she's afraid, but because she wants to prepare. And she calls the entire Jewish community to these 3 days of fasting as well before she does anything. And so we might think, okay, Esther needs more prayers. She needs to sort of fill up this prayer meter in order to win God to her side or to gain his favor or something like this. And so she takes these 3 days to gather herself, get God on her side, and then go in. But that's not where the text leads us. And that's not how God works. That's not how fasting or prayer works. Esther doesn't go to the king because she's convinced that after this fast, the odds will be in her favor. God will bless her plan. She goes in without knowing whether or not the scepter is going to come down. Ahasuerus is an unpredictable man. He doesn't think things through. He goes by whim. She goes without knowing what God's response to the fasting and the prayer is. There's no answer back that she receives here or in the future parts of the story. And she goes in without a single piece of new information. In verse 11, she sort of laid out all the reasons why this plan won't work or may not work. Nothing's changed since then. There's no new information. So what did change between verse 11 and verse 16? It's not the risk. That's the same. What changed is Esther's posture. She turns to God in trust before walking through the door into the king's chambers. Not hoping for a blueprint, not hoping for a divine download so that she can decode her situation. She turns to the Lord because there's nowhere else to turn in times like this. Certainly, Esther would echo what the psalmist says in Psalm 73, "Who do I have in heaven but you? There's nothing on earth I desire except you. My body and my heart fail, but God is my heart's rock and my portion forever." Most of us don't struggle to affirm that we should trust God in times like this or throughout our lives. We agree that we should trust God in principle. What we struggle with is those times we actually need to trust God, to lean on him, those actual circumstances where that trust is called for. We often want to have a good idea of how things are going to turn out before we act. We want the doors we walk through to sort of be like screen doors where we can see what's on the other side before we open them and go through. In many ways, we often don't want to have faith or trust at all. We want more information so we know what's going to happen. We want to see where the circumstance is going. We want clarity before we act. And that's not like a stupid thing to think or to feel. It's not silly. It's not ignorant. It's not bucking against God's authority or sovereignty. It's not trying to be reckless. In many ways, it's good and wise. But if that's the reasoning behind every decision and every action and every choice, if we stay in that pattern of thought long enough, wanting to know how things are going to turn out before we do anything, then we're in danger. In danger of being too uncomfortable with the vulnerability and with the dependence that's called for as God's people who are called to trust in Him. Our God is present with us by His Spirit. The Spirit's invisible. He speaks to us through words delivered through human beings, through His written word as well. He shows us His grace, not in person. We don't see Christ. He doesn't hand us things or speak to us directly, but His favor comes through the sacraments and through the word. But all of these things require great faith. His presence can't be secured. It can't be contained through something we can hold or something we can see. This was the problem for the Israelites in the wilderness. They had seen in these great ways how God had been with them. He led them with the pillar of cloud and fire. They'd seen how He split the sea. They'd received the manna from above. But then when Moses went up the mountain and stayed there for a long time, they got uncomfortable in the waiting and the uncertainty. They couldn't handle that open-endedness of this God who spoke through events they couldn't control and who made promises where they weren't sure when those promises were going to be fulfilled or how exactly. And so they constructed the golden calf, not because they denied God, but because they wanted His presence and His power to be made permanent and visible and controllable, something they could point to, something they could touch, something they could carry instead of being carried by God. Esther, in this chapter, takes the exact opposite posture. The golden calf was this reaching for certainty that God hadn't given, but Esther's fast is comfortable. It remains in that uncertainty of not knowing, the uncertainty of prayer. The calf was replacing waiting with action. But Esther's fast is pious waiting. She doesn't act immediately. She waits on the Lord. And she does it with her community before acting. And the fast didn't reverse the circumstances. It didn't make God visible. It didn't make Him speak back to her. It didn't give her any new information. Instead, it reoriented her. As she turned to the Lord, that's what made her courageous faithfulness possible. As I mentioned before, Esther's fast ran through Passover, this feast that Israel was commanded to keep. She didn't have permission from a prophet to do this. She didn't have a special exception communicated to her. And so Esther decides to not only break Persian law to go see the king, but to command God's people to break His law in seeking Him, the King of Kings. And so this crisis has banished the status quo, how things normally operate for God's people. They are called by Queen Esther to trust the lawgiver more than the law in this circumstance. And again, this is not a private fast just for Esther. The entire Jewish community in Susa fasts with her. The posture of trust that she takes is a communal one, depending not only on God, but on His people as well. And so, brothers and sisters, we know there are many things in our lives that we can't deal with ourselves. We can't deal with just our family. We are dependent people. We need help. And one of the reasons that we are made a communion of the saints by the Spirit is to be that help for one another, to turn to each other in these situations where the paths put before us are terrifying to us. When our consciences are prompting us to take a certain action, but the uncertainty of the outcome of that action, the fear, the anxiety that comes with it, makes us not want to act. but we're created to be dependent creatures, to help one another, to pray for one another, most importantly, to bring ourselves together in that same posture of trust in the Lord. Another thing we know as readers outside the story, readers of this story rather than characters in it, we know what Mordecai gestured to with his question, who knows? He's gesturing to God's plan, God's promise. God was paying attention to the fast. He heard his people's prayers. He would not let them be utterly annihilated. We know he's already been arranging their deliverance. God is not going to be outmaneuvered in this story. But what we also see from our place outside of Esther's story is that the posture this chapter commends to us, Esther's posture of courageous faithfulness. The ultimate expression of that is not in Esther, but in the account we read earlier. Someone who also faced an open door that no human eye could see through, who also turned to the Lord in prayer, not on a palace, but on a hillside, and presented himself with complete courage and faithfulness, who prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." Esther says, "If I perish, I perish." Jesus said, "Not my will, but yours." Both walk through that difficult door, but the difference is Esther acts under irreducible uncertainty. She doesn't know what comes on the other side. But Jesus acted under irreducible obedience. He knew exactly what was waiting for him. He knew what the Father's plan was for him, the pain and the shame and the suffering and the death that was before him. And he went. And because he went, we don't pray to an unknown God or a God who we don't know how he feels toward us. We pray and we turn to and we trust in a God we know is for us and who loves us in Jesus because of what Jesus has done. The God who lived and died and rose again and ascended for us and poured out his Spirit on us and declared us righteous and adopted us and has promised us life forever with him. This is the God we serve. And that's the ground beneath the posture of courageous faithfulness. It's not self-generated bravery that allows us to act with courage. It's not more information. It's the right information about the God who is ours. Not the sense that we finally read the situation clearly, but God's character, proven on the cross, working behind the scenes in ways that we'll never see or know, and working in every season of our lives. And so, brothers and sisters, we can have courageous faithfulness in our lives, despite all the things we don't know, because of the God we do know, and the God who knows us and loves us in Jesus Christ. Let's pray.